Mark and Emily lived in a small, quiet town in the northern part of the country. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other and the pace of life was slow and easy. Their life together had always seemed perfect, or at least that's what Mark thought. He had worked for 2 decades as a truck driver, and now in the quieter years of his life he had a new role. As a logistics supervisor, Mark found himself with more time at home, more time to spend with Emily, the woman he had married all those years ago. Mark had always admired how hard Emily worked at the local aesthetic clinic. Her job had always made her look radiant, but it wasn't until recently that Mark noticed a change in her. Emily had always been more on the simple side, comfortable in casual clothes, her face often free of heavy makeup. But something was different now. She started wearing tight dresses, bold makeup, and was out late more and more often, returning home with an air of secrecy. It was subtle at first, almost like a small shift that Mark couldn't quite put his finger on. She started to look different, feel different, and Mark felt a strange distance growing between them. At first he brushed it off, thinking she was just going through a phase. Maybe the demands of her job had changed her, maybe it was the social scene, but as time passed, he couldn't help but feel that there was something more to it. And yet Mark said nothing. He couldn't bear the thought of confronting her, not when they'd shared so many years of happiness together. It was on a cold autumn evening that everything started to unravel. Mark came home early from work, planning to surprise Emily. He wasn't sure what he expected, but certainly not what he found. As he stepped into their bedroom, he was stunned to see Emily standing before the mirror, adjusting a red dress that he had never seen before. It was bold, elegant, and far too extravagant for a woman who had always preferred simplicity. Mark's stomach sank as he watched her, unable to tear his gaze away from the unfamiliar scene. She turned and smiled at him, but there was something in her eyes, a hint of discomfort, perhaps? She quickly told him she was going out with some friends. There was no explanation beyond that. It wasn't unusual for Emily to have a social life, but Mark couldn't shake the feeling that tonight was different. He could feel his heart pounding as Emily grabbed her purse and left without a word about where she was going or when she would be back. It was the second time this week that she had disappeared for the night without explanation. Mark stood by the door watching her leave. He felt a deep unease settle in his chest, but he did nothing. He just watched, waiting for something that he couldn't even name. Later that night, as he walked past the bedroom, something caught his eye. Emily's gym bag was open, carelessly thrown on the chair by the window. He hesitated for a moment before he walked over and picked it up. He didn't know why he did it, but something told him he needed to know what was inside. As his hands dug through the contents of the bag, he felt his heart stop when he pulled out a t-shirt that clearly didn't belong to him. It wasn't his, and it certainly wasn't Emily's. His pulse quickened as the reality of the situation began to sink in. The shirt had a distinct logo on it, one that he recognized from the local bar, a place Emily had mentioned only in passing. It was a popular hangout spot, where people went to unwind after a long day. But it wasn't the place that bothered him, it was the idea of Emily spending time there with someone else without mentioning it to him. She had always been upfront about where she went and who she went with. Until now. Mark held the shirt in his hands for a long moment, as if the fabric itself could explain everything. But it didn't. There were no answers in the shirt, only questions. He couldn't deny the truth anymore, no matter how much he wanted to. Emily had been hiding something from him, and the evidence was right there, staring him in the face. His mind raced. He tried to push the thoughts away to convince himself that it was all just a misunderstanding, but deep down, Mark knew he couldn't ignore what he had found. He had to confront her. He had to know the truth even if it destroyed everything. The door creaked open, and Mark's heart skipped a beat when he heard the familiar sound of keys rattling in the front door. Emily was home. He could hear her footsteps echo in the hallway. This was it. The moment he had feared, the moment when his suspicions would either be confirmed or shattered. Emily walked into the living room, a bright smile on her face, but it faltered when she saw Mark standing by the door. His hands were still clenched around the shirt, his face a mask of emotion that Emily couldn't read. "Mark?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Whose shirt is this, Emily?" he asked, his voice steady but filled with the weight of all the unspoken words between them. Emily's eyes widened, and for a moment she seemed to hesitate. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Mark could see her mind racing, searching for the right answer, the right excuse. But there were no words that could erase what had already been revealed. "Tell me the truth," Mark demanded, his voice shaking ever so slightly. "Is there someone else?" The silence in the room was deafening. Emily's eyes darted around the room, looking anywhere but at Mark. She opened her mouth but nothing came out. Mark could feel his heart breaking in real time, the weight of her silence heavier than any answer could ever be. "Mark, I'm sorry. I didn't know how to tell you." "It's complicated," Emily began, but Mark was no longer listening. He didn't need to hear any more excuses, not when the truth was already in front of him. He turned away, the anger and betrayal surging within him, but he said nothing. Emily reached out to him, but he stepped back, his face a mask of hurt and disbelief. "I can't do this anymore, Emily," Mark whispered. "I just can't." And with those words, the life they had built together began to crumble, piece by piece. The silence that followed Mark's words was suffocating. Emily stood frozen, her outstretched hand lingering in the air, waiting for something, anything, to bridge the gap between them. But there was nothing left to say. Mark's decision had already been made, and no amount of pleading or explaining could change that. He could see the confusion and panic in her eyes, but it didn't matter anymore. The trust they had shared was shattered, and there was nothing Emily could do to repair it. Mark turned away from her, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't look at her, not now, not when the person he loved more than anything had betrayed him in the most painful way possible. I didn't mean for this to happen," Emily whispered, her voice breaking. But Mark was already walking toward the door, grabbing his jacket from the hook near the entrance. He couldn't stay here any longer, not with her standing there, not with the weight of the lies between them. Emily reached for him, but he shrugged her off without a word. He wasn't sure where he was going, but he knew that he couldn't stay in that house, in that life, any longer. Mark stepped outside into the cool night air, his mind racing. The city lights blinked in the distance, but he didn't see them. He didn't see anything. His thoughts were clouded with the image of Emily in that red dress, the look on her face when she saw the shirt, the way she tried to justify everything. None of it made sense anymore. Everything they had was a lie. He walked aimlessly through the quiet streets, the cold air biting at his skin. His mind replayed the conversation over and over, each word, each moment, until he felt like he was drowning in it. He couldn't escape it. The betrayal. The deceit. The realization that the woman he had trusted, the woman he had built his life with, had been hiding something from him all along. But even as anger churned in his gut, there was something else. Something deeper. Sadness. A crushing, overwhelming sadness. How had they gotten here? How had they gone from being a couple that shared everything to strangers who couldn't even look each other in the eye? As Mark wandered through the dark streets, he couldn't help but wonder if he had missed the signs all along. Had he been blind to the changes in Emily? Had he been so caught up in his own life, in his own work, that he failed to notice the growing distance between them? He stopped at a park bench, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He sat down, his hands trembling as he ran them through his hair. He closed his eyes, trying to gather his thoughts, but all he could hear was the sound of Emily's voice, her apologies, her explanations. None of it mattered now. The damage had already been done. Meanwhile, back at the house, Emily stood by the door, staring at the empty space where Mark had been just moments ago. Her heart ached as she listened to the sound of his footsteps fading into the distance. She had known deep down that this day was coming. She had known that the lies would eventually catch up to her, but she had never imagined it would happen like this. She had always thought she could control the situation. She had thought she could keep up the facade, hide her secrets, and continue to live in the illusion of their perfect life. But now, as she stood in the silence of their home, she realized how wrong she had been. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she quickly wiped them away, not wanting to break down just yet. She had always been strong, independent, and in control. But now all of that seemed meaningless. She had lost everything. Emily sank to the couch, her hands gripping the fabric as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. She had always believed that love could fix anything. But now she wasn't so sure. Mark had left, and she had no idea where he was, what he was thinking, or if he would ever come back. The thought of losing him, of losing everything they had built together, was too much to bear. She had made a mistake. A huge mistake. And now it was too late to take it back. Emily's mind raced as she thought back to the last few months. The late nights out with her friends, the secret meetings, the growing distance between her and Mark. It all seemed so clear now in hindsight. But at the time she had justified it all. She had told herself that it was just a phase, that it didn't mean anything. But it did mean something. It meant that she had lost herself along the way. She had let the desire for excitement, for validation, cloud her judgment. And now the consequences were more than she could bear. She could only sit in the dark silence, her thoughts echoing in her mind, as the realization of what she had done began to settle in. She had betrayed the one person who had always been there for her. And now she was alone. As the night wore on, Mark remained in the park, his mind still spinning. He had no answers, no direction, no idea what his next step would be. All he knew was that he couldn't go back. Not yet. Maybe not ever. For the first time in a long time, he didn't know who he was. His life, his relationship with Emily, it all felt like a lie. But as the cold wind bit at his skin, a strange sense of clarity began to form. He didn't need to have all the answers right now. What mattered was that he was taking control of his life again. He was no longer bound by the illusions of the past. He could start over, rebuild himself, find out who he really was without the weight of Emily's betrayal holding him back. And for the first time in a long time, Mark felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was life after all of this. Life without Emily. Life without the lies. The following days felt like a blur to Mark. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt so disconnected, so lost in his own life. The small town he had once found comforting now felt suffocating. Everywhere he looked, memories of Emily were everywhere. Every street corner, every cafe, even their favorite grocery store. It was as if the life they had shared was lingering in the air, invisible but palpable. He spent his days at home, cleaning, organizing, trying to create some kind of routine to fill the void. The house felt emptier without her. Even though their relationship had been strained, it was still her home. He couldn't escape the feeling that the walls were closing in around him. But despite the emptiness, Mark couldn't deny that a part of him felt a strange relief. No more pretending. No more hiding. He didn't have to fight to maintain the illusion of happiness anymore. He had stepped out of the lie, even if it meant facing the painful truth. And while the weight of that truth still pressed heavily on his chest, there was something liberating about it. For the first time in months, he wasn't holding his breath. He started doing things he hadn't done in years, things he had once enjoyed but had pushed aside for the sake of his relationship with Emily. He picked up his guitar again, strumming aimlessly as the chords filled the empty space of the living room. He even signed up for a writing class at the local community center, something he had always wanted to do but never had the time for. Slowly, his days began to feel less like a series of numb routines and more like a genuine attempt to rebuild. But there were still moments when the loneliness crept back in, when he would sit down in front of the TV, expecting Emily to walk in with a plate of food or sit next to him on the couch. He would reach for his phone to text her, but then remember. The sting of reality would hit him again, she was gone. Mark had heard nothing from Emily since that night. She hadn't called, hadn't tried to explain herself further. At first he was angry. Furious that she hadn't fought for them, that she hadn't even tried to make things right. But then, as the days passed, a sense of clarity began to form. Emily had made her choice. And it was up to him to decide what to do with the pieces of his life that remained. One morning, as Mark sat on the porch, sipping his coffee and watching the sunrise, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Emily. His heart skipped a beat and for a moment he froze. He didn't know if he was ready to face her again, to hear her explanations, to re-enter that world of uncertainty. But the message was brief. Can we talk? The question lingered in his mind as he stared at the screen. Part of him wanted to ignore it, to continue living his life without her. But another part, the part that still remembered the love they once shared, was curious. He wanted to know why. Why had she done this? What had driven her to betray him in such a way? He decided to reply. Where? Emily responded almost immediately. The cafe on 5th Street. In an hour? Mark hesitated. An hour. That was enough time to back out, to change his mind, to pretend like he hadn't seen the message. But he couldn't. He couldn't keep running from this. He needed answers even if they would hurt. At the cafe, Mark arrived early, unsure of what to expect. The place was quiet, the kind of coffee shop that felt familiar and warm. He sat by the window, his fingers drumming nervously on the table. The clock ticked loudly in the silence. Every minute felt like an eternity. Finally the door opened and Emily walked in. She looked different, more vulnerable, less put together than usual. Her eyes were red and she seemed hesitant, almost unsure of herself. Mark stood up as she approached, and they exchanged a brief, awkward hug. It felt foreign, like something they used to do but couldn't anymore. Emily sat across from him, avoiding his gaze at first. She ordered a coffee, but Mark could tell she wasn't really focused on the drink. Her fingers were fidgeting with the sleeve of her cup, and her lips trembled slightly as she spoke. I know I don't deserve this, she began, her voice soft. But I needed to see you, Mark. I needed to apologize. Mark remained silent, his gaze fixed on her, waiting for the explanation he had been craving. He had so many questions, so many things he wanted to say. But he remained patient. He needed to hear her out. "I've been thinking about everything, about us," Emily continued, her voice shaking now. "And I know I messed up. I should have been honest with you, but I was afraid. I was afraid of losing you, and I thought I could handle everything on my own." Mark listened quietly, but the pain in her words didn't lessen the ache in his chest. He had already heard these types of apologies before. But this time something was different. The sincerity in Emily's voice, the rawness of her emotions. It felt real, but was it too little, too late? "I had a history, Mark," Emily confessed, her eyes finally meeting his. "A history I didn't want you to know about. I thought I could bury it, pretend like it wasn't a part of me. But it was. And I let it affect everything. I started making bad choices. I pushed you away and I started lying, not because I wanted to hurt you but because I was trying to protect myself." Mark absorbed her words, trying to make sense of the story she was telling. She wasn't just apologizing for the affair. She was apologizing for the choices that had led to it. She wasn't trying to defend herself, but rather explain why she had acted the way she did. "I should have trusted you, Mark," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I should have come to you. I should have shared everything with you, but I didn't. And now I've lost everything." Mark felt the weight of her words, but they didn't soften the hurt he had been carrying for days. He had loved her. He had trusted her. And she had broken that trust in the worst way possible. Yet, despite everything, part of him still wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that this apology was real. "I can't take back what I've done," Emily whispered. "But I want to try. I want to try and make things right if you'll let me." Mark looked into her eyes, searching for something. Some sign that this wasn't just another empty promise. He had to make a choice. He had to decide whether or not he could forgive her, whether or not he could rebuild from the wreckage of their relationship. The silence stretched between them, and Mark's heart was heavy with the weight of the decision before him. Mark sat there, staring into Emily's eyes, feeling the weight of her words pressing down on him. The cafe around them was quiet, the soft hum of background music barely audible above the pounding of his own heartbeat. He had heard her apologies, felt the sincerity in her voice, but there was still a storm of emotions swirling inside him. Could he really forgive her? Could he look past the betrayal, past the lies, and rebuild the trust they had once shared? The pain he had felt in those first few days after she left, the anger, the confusion, was it all something he could move beyond? Was forgiveness even possible? "Mark," Emily said softly, breaking his thoughts. "I know it's not going to be easy. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness and I'm not asking for it right away. But I want to show you that I'm sorry. I want to show you that I can be better." Mark took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing thoughts. He had spent so much time in the past few days trying to come to terms with everything, trying to figure out where he went wrong, where they went wrong. He had told himself that he didn't need her, that he could move on and start fresh. But hearing her say these things, seeing the rawness in her eyes, it made it harder than he had imagined. "I don't know, Emily," Mark finally spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know if I can just forget what happened. I don't know if I can go back to what we had before." His words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, there was only silence. Emily's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't reach for him, didn't beg for his forgiveness. Instead, she nodded slowly as if understanding exactly what he was feeling. "I understand," she whispered. "I don't expect things to be easy. I don't expect you to just forgive me or to forget everything. I know it's going to take time. But I'm willing to wait. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to show you that I've changed." Mark's heart wavered at her words, but his mind was still clouded with doubt. The emotional toll of their relationship was far from over. The pain, the mistrust, it was still there gnawing at him. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that they could start over, that they could rebuild something stronger than before. But a part of him feared that the damage had already been done, that no matter how much Emily had changed, they could never go back to what they once had. "I need some time, Emily," Mark said softly, his voice strained. "I need time to think, to process everything. This isn't something I can just move past." Emily nodded again, tears spilling down her cheeks now. She didn't try to stop them, didn't make excuses. She simply sat there, looking at Mark with an expression of deep regret, as if she were silently begging him to understand. "I'll give you all the time you need," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "I'll wait, Mark. I'll wait as long as it takes." Mark felt a pang of guilt stir within him. He could see the pain in her eyes, the desperation for a chance to make things right. But he also knew that he wasn't ready to forgive her, not yet. Not when the wounds were still fresh, not when he was still trying to figure out who he was without her by his side. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He could feel Emily's gaze on him as he made his way to the door, but he didn't turn back. He couldn't. The weight of the decision he had just made hung heavily on him, and as he stepped out into the cool air, he realized that he wasn't just walking away from Emily. He was walking away from everything he had known. The life they shared, the memories, they were all behind him now. As Mark walked down the street, his footsteps echoing in the empty night, he thought about what Emily had said. He thought about the woman she had been, the woman she was trying to become. And for the first time since that night, he allowed himself to hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, there could be a way forward. But not yet. Not now. He needed time to heal. Time to be alone. Emily sat in the cafe long after Mark had left, the room growing darker as the evening wore on. She hadn't expected things to be easy, hadn't expected him to forgive her on the spot. But she had hoped that he would see the sincerity in her eyes, the regret in her heart. She had hoped that he would understand that she was trying to change. But Mark had left and now she was alone. The weight of her mistakes pressed down on her, and for the first time she felt the full extent of the damage she had caused. She had betrayed the one person she loved and now she had to live with the consequences. She stayed at the cafe for a while longer, her mind racing as she replayed the conversation over and over. There was so much she wanted to say to him, so much she wanted to explain. But it didn't matter anymore. The words had already been spoken, and Mark had already made his decision. Now it was up to her to show him that she could be the woman he deserved. But would it be enough? As Emily left the cafe, she walked down the street, her heart heavy with uncertainty. The road ahead was unclear, but she was determined to try. She had lost so much, but she wasn't ready to give up yet. She couldn't be. For the first time in a long while, Emily felt like she had a chance to rebuild, to find herself again. But it wasn't just about her. It was about Mark. And only time would tell if they could ever find their way back to each other. The days that followed were slow, each one blending into the next as Mark tried to find his footing in a life that felt unfamiliar. Emily's words echoed in his mind, but he tried to push them away, focusing instead on the life he was trying to rebuild. He was determined to move forward, to reclaim the life that had been shattered by betrayal. He spent his days working on personal projects, reconnecting with old friends, and taking up hobbies he had long abandoned. The guitar he had dusted off after months of neglect now sat by the couch, a quiet reminder of the man he used to be, before Emily's lies had taken root. There was a strange sense of freedom in the solitude, and for a brief moment, Mark allowed himself to feel something he hadn't felt in a long time: peace. But peace didn't last long. It never did. There were moments, usually at night when the world was quiet, when Mark's thoughts would drift back to Emily. He would remember their laughter, their shared dreams, the way she used to hold him close at night, as if nothing could ever come between them. Then the memories would sour, and the pain of betrayal would rise up again, just as sharp and raw as the night he discovered the truth. He had told her he needed time and he meant it. But even as the days stretched into weeks, he found himself thinking about her more than he cared to admit. He wanted to believe that she was truly changing, that she was doing the work to rebuild herself. But doubt lingered, nagging at him from the corners of his mind. Could he really trust her again? Could he let her back into his life after everything that had happened? Meanwhile, Emily was doing the work she had promised herself she would do. She threw herself into therapy, hoping to heal from the trauma of her past that had led to her destructive choices. It wasn't easy. It was painful, often leaving her raw and vulnerable, but she knew it was the only way to truly change. She couldn't go back to the woman she had been, the woman who had let fear and insecurity dictate her actions. Emily spent her nights alone, reading self-help books, journaling, and reflecting on her past mistakes. She spent hours thinking about Mark, wondering if he would ever give her a second chance. She couldn't blame him for taking the time he needed. She had shattered his trust, and it would take more than a few apologies to fix that. But she was determined to show him that she had changed. She didn't want to be the person she had been. She wanted to be someone worthy of his love and trust again, if that was even possible. She was learning that forgiveness wasn't something that could be rushed. It had to be earned, and she was willing to do whatever it took to prove herself to him. One evening, after another long therapy session, Emily sat on her couch, staring at her phone. She had been resisting the urge to reach out to Mark, not wanting to push him, but she knew that the longer she waited, the harder it would be to reconnect. She needed to know if he was still willing to even consider the possibility of them, or if he had truly moved on. With a deep breath, she tapped out a message. Mark, I know I'm asking a lot, but I would really appreciate it if we could talk again. Not to go over the past, but to see if there's a way forward. I understand if you need more time, but I wanted to reach out. I'm here when you're ready. Emily asterisk. She hesitated for a moment before hitting send, her heart racing in her chest. She didn't know if he would reply. She didn't know if he would even want to talk to her. But she had to try. She had to take the first step, even if it meant facing the possibility of rejection. Hours passed without a response. Emily tried to distract herself, but every time her phone buzzed, her heart skipped a beat, only to be met with disappointment when it wasn't from Mark. She tried to focus on her work, but her thoughts kept drifting back to him. She wondered if he was reading her message, weighing his options, trying to decide what to do. The next day, when Emily had nearly convinced herself that Mark wasn't ready to talk, her phone rang. It was an unknown number. Her heart jumped in her throat. She didn't know whether to answer, but she did anyway. Hello? Emily, Mark's voice came through, quiet but steady. It's me. She could barely breathe. She had expected the worst, but hearing his voice, hearing him say her name, felt like a lifeline. She hadn't realized just how much she had missed him until that very moment. I didn't think you'd call, Emily admitted, her voice trembling slightly. Mark was silent for a long moment before he spoke again. I've been thinking, Emily, about everything, about what you said, and I still don't know what the future holds. But I'm willing to talk. I'm willing to see if there's any way forward, if that's something you want too. Emily's heart swelled with a mixture of relief and hope. It wasn't a promise of reconciliation, but it was a chance. A chance for them to rebuild something, no matter how small the starting point. I want that, Emily said, her voice steady now. I want to try. But I know it's going to take time. I'm not asking for anything more than that. Just time. I understand, Mark replied. I think we both need that. They agreed to meet at a neutral location the following evening. It wasn't much, but it was a step forward, a fragile thread of connection that still lingered between them. Emily knew that this wasn't going to be easy. Rebuilding a relationship after everything that had happened would take time, effort, and trust, things that had been broken but not beyond repair. The moment she hung up, Emily sat back against the couch, her mind racing. She had been waiting for this moment, but now that it was here, she wasn't sure what to expect. What would happen when they sat down face to face again? Would Mark still see her as the woman he had loved, or had the hurt been too much to overcome? She didn't have the answers, but for the first time in weeks she felt like she was no longer standing still. She was moving forward, no matter how slowly, no matter how uncertain the road ahead seemed. The evening of their meeting arrived quickly, and Mark found himself pacing in his apartment, feeling an unfamiliar mix of emotions. A part of him wanted to run, to call it all off, to avoid facing the woman who had broken his heart. But another part, the part that still loved her, even if he didn't fully trust her, urged him to go, to give this one last chance to understand what had happened between them. He had spent so many nights alone, reliving the past, trying to make sense of everything that had gone wrong. There were so many unanswered questions, so many layers of hurt. But tonight was different. Tonight he was going to listen, not to the old wounds, but to what Emily had to say, to the woman she had become. He didn't know what would happen after tonight, but he knew that for the first time in a long while, he was ready to face the truth. He arrived at the small park they had agreed on. It was a quiet, peaceful place, with benches nestled under the trees and a calm pond reflecting the light of the setting sun. It felt like a neutral ground, a place where they could start anew, away from the memories of their home and their past. Mark sat on one of the benches, waiting. His hands were clasped together, his mind racing. It felt like the weight of the world rested on this moment, this fragile, uncertain moment. He wondered if he could truly forgive Emily, if he could ever trust her again, or if they would simply be two people drifting apart, clinging to the remnants of something that was no longer real. A few minutes later, Emily arrived, walking slowly as if unsure of her welcome. She wore a simple dress, her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail, and for a moment, Mark couldn't help but notice how different she looked. Softer, less guarded, like a woman who had been through something difficult and was now trying to find her way back. He had always admired her beauty, but now he found himself focusing on something deeper, the vulnerability in her eyes, the rawness of her presence. She hesitated when she saw him, standing at the edge of the bench, not knowing if she should sit beside him or give him space. But Mark's gaze was steady, and when their eyes met, something shifted between them, something unspoken, a small flicker of hope. "Hi," Emily said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hi," Mark replied, his voice equally quiet. He patted the space beside him, a silent invitation. She sat down slowly, the space between them feeling wide and uncertain. Neither of them spoke for a long moment, both unsure of how to begin. Emily took a deep breath, her fingers twisting the fabric of her dress nervously. I don't know where to start, she admitted. I know I've hurt you. And I know that nothing I say can change the past. But I need you to know that I've been working on myself. I've been going to therapy, I've been trying to figure out who I really am, and I've realized just how much I've lost. I've lost myself, and I've lost you. Mark listened, his expression neutral but attentive. He had heard apologies before, but there was something different about this one. There was no pleading, no expectation that he would forgive her right away. Just a quiet acceptance of the reality that things had changed, and maybe, just maybe, they could change again. I wasn't honest with you, Mark, Emily continued, her voice cracking slightly. And I've hurt you more than I could ever explain. But I need you to know that I'm not that person anymore. I've learned things about myself that I didn't want to face. I've made mistakes, but I'm trying to make them right. Not just with you but with myself. Mark took a moment to absorb her words. He could see that she had changed. He could hear the sincerity in her voice, feel the weight of her regret, but part of him was still holding back, still unsure if he was ready to take that leap of faith again. The trust had been broken in ways that couldn't easily be repaired, and he wasn't sure if it could ever be restored to what it once was. I don't know if I can ever forget what happened, Mark said, his voice calm but firm. I don't know if I can go back to the way things were. But I can listen. I can hear you out. I can see who you are now. Emily nodded slowly, her eyes filled with gratitude and sadness. I don't expect you to forget. I don't expect everything to be okay right away. But I do hope that we can rebuild something. Maybe not what we had before, but something new. Something honest. Mark looked at her for a long time, weighing his options. He could walk away from her, and never look back. He could continue living his life without the constant reminder of betrayal. But there was a part of him, a small part, that still cared for her. He wasn't sure if it was love or if it was just the comfort of familiarity, but the desire to try, to see if something could be salvaged, was still there. I don't know if I'm ready to jump back into anything, Mark said, his tone softening. But I'm willing to see where this goes. I'm willing to take things slow. Emily's face lit up with a mixture of relief and hope. I can't ask for more than that, she said, her voice filled with emotion. I'm willing to take it slow too. I just want a chance to prove that I've changed. That I'm not the person I was. Mark nodded. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a spark of possibility. Maybe this was the beginning of something new. Maybe, despite everything that had happened, there was still a chance for them to build something together again. Not the same relationship, not the same love, but something real. Something honest. The sun was setting behind them, casting a warm golden light over the park. For a brief moment, Mark allowed himself to imagine a future where they both healed, where they both found peace in themselves and in each other. It was a long road ahead and the journey would be difficult, but for the first time he felt like they were both ready to try. I don't know what comes next, Mark said, standing up. But I'm willing to find out. Emily smiled softly, the weight of her past still visible in her eyes, but a glimmer of hope there as well. Me too. They stood there for a moment, the silence between them now comfortable, no longer filled with uncertainty. It was a small step, but it was a step in the right direction. And maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other, one day at a time.